And thank you everyone for joining me today. So miscommunication in the workplace, it is unavoidable. And setting aside hidden motives, passive aggressive behavior, power dynamics, things like that, most communication and the miscommunications, they're really well intended and they happen for a number of reasons. Cultural differences like different languages or jargon. Speaking of jargon, anybody ever be in a room or a meeting and somebody throws out an acronym and you don't know what it stands for? I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me, and I just pretend like I know what they're saying until after the meeting when I can ask somebody, what does ABCDEFG stand for? You know, common miscommunication, poor instructions. People are listening with selective listening. They're waiting till you're done to tell you what you did wrong. Or to tell you, like, send a rebuttal. They're distracted. There are all kinds of reasons. And as a result of those miscommunications, there can be some unintended impacts. And some of those can be leave the other person feeling hurt. It can feel divisive. And this can be because there are misrepresentation or a misreading cues, whether they're body language, expressions, etc. So you compound those in kind of routine miscommunications with different emotional states, different types of cues, visual and movement, cultural differences, tone of voice and delivery. So what we're going to talk about today is how all of those things can come together and result in microaggressions for any and all of those reasons. As our world and our workplaces become more diverse, there is a higher chance that microaggressions are going to happen as a result of these miscommunications. We're starting to learn more about different dimensions of diversity. So much of the focus has been on the visible dimensions, you know, race, gender, gender expression, etc. But there are many more differences that are invisible. Sometimes the ones we think are visible aren't quite what we think. And so there can be more and more misunderstandings, especially when we start speaking to a presumption around what we think someone else's identity is. And once you start talking about something that hits each of us at the identity level, it can start to trigger some of these unintended consequences, these microaggressions. So it's really important for us to learn to identify what these slights and snubs actually look and feel like, what's behind them, maybe what's driving them, and then how do we respond to them? That will help us foster not just a more inclusive workforce in general, workplace in general, but what part of the reason it'll feel more inclusive is because it'll feel safer. It'll feel safer because if and when these things happen, I have a strategy to respond to them. So before we go any further, I want to dive in with the very first polling question. So let's go ahead and get that one launched if we could.
Yes, poll number 1 is up and running.
Excellent. Now I wanted to have this open because I really wanted to get a sense of how familiar you all are with today's topic. And to be fair, I included the just here for the CPE option on purpose because frankly, some people are here for the CPE and that's okay. And I say that because even if that's the case, what I invite you to do is to sit with us, stay with us, you know, have a little curiosity. And no matter the reason, I'm just really glad you're here. So hopefully I'm watching the results coming in. So far, 14% said they're here for the CPE. Ha! Welcome.
All right, we'll give it another 10 seconds here. Again, this is poll number 1 out of 4.
Before you close it, I just want to invite people as we go along, share your thoughts and experiences as well as your questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on them as we keep going. Go forward.
All right, closing in 3, 2, and 1. I'll quickly share those results because I know they like to see that. 43% said somewhat familiar, followed by 34% with new to me.
Okay, so for the majority, it's either new or it's a refresher. All right, so let's start. We're gonna break this down into 3 sections. So what are microaggressions? What is their impact on culture? And then how do we respond to them? So starting with our first section, what are microaggressions? How about we start?
Jenna, Sorry to interrupt. We lost your slides.
Okay.
I didn't know if you wanted those back up.
That,
there we go. Perfect. Yes,
excellent.
thank you.
Thank you. All right, so good. We're starting with the definition. A microaggression is a sensitive, often subtle remark or behavior, verbal or nonverbal, and it communicates hostile or negative insults, intentionally or unintentionally, towards a person or a group. Now, the term was coined by Dr. Chester Pierce. Dr. Chester Pierce was a Harvard psychiatrist, and he was describing the racial insults and dismissals that he observed white people expressing toward Black people specifically. The term micro does not mean the impact is small. It actually is thinking, it talks more about the scale of that. And so what's interesting is that Dr. Pierce, he was an African American psychiatrist. And so for him, he was born in 1927, and he lived through this whole journey from, growing up in a society that was segregated to moving through the anti-discrimination, equal opportunity period, when the Civil Rights Act was passed and so many other laws were passed. And then into the current day, which is really around expectations of acceptance and transparency and opportunity. So it's really interesting, all that work and his experiences. And we're still looking at this definition today, and it's even increasingly important as we start having more transparent conversations around identity in the workforce. Now let's look at that and break that definition down a little bit more. I want to just call attention out to a couple of things. Number one, subtle. It doesn't have to be, and it often is not overt. It's not well, there are some, we'll talk about that definition in a moment, but it's not an overt act of hostility or discrimination. And in fact, the person doing it or saying it might not even be aware. The second one is that it's not just a remark, it can be a behavior, it can be an expression, and it doesn't have to be intentional. Well, that's not what I said, or that's not what I intended, is often an indication that it's not at all what the person thought the reaction was going to be to the thing they were saying or the way they were acting. And then the last one, the other one I want to pull out here, is that it doesn't have to just be to a person. It can also be to a group. And it's often a group or a person that's marginalized. So a member of a marginalized community or marginalized identity. Now, the big question is what transforms something from a regular interaction to a microaggression. And it's going to be something that falls into all of these categories, the subtlety, and excuse me, what's behind it is often bias. And we're going to look at that as well. It has to do with stereotypes, perceptions, expectations, etc. Not just in society, but how are things supposed to be here at work? How are we expecting people to show up, and what are the things we expect people to bring with them into the workforce compared to what we might be observing? So here, just a nice quick list of some of the more common workplace microaggressions. I have on the bottom of the slide titles. I realize now it's very faint, but there are titles for all of the articles that I'm referencing in case you want to go and read it. But these are pretty common, a name that's hard to pronounce or somebody making fun of an accent. It might be intended as a joke, but that doesn't make it any less insulting. Ignoring somebody, exhibiting some kind of a prejudice, unintentionally, of course, or comment that's thoughtless or insensitive. Now let's walk through some very specific examples. So in this one, we have Elise, white female, and she's paying a compliment to her Korean female colleague, Ji-won, and she says, "Your English is excellent. Where did you learn to speak so fluently?" Now, what if Ji-won was born in the United States? English is, in fact, her first language. What is this doing? It's perpetuating the stereotype that somebody from Asian descent is not expected to be proficient. It suggests that English isn't their first language. It suggests that somebody who's foreign can't speak English as well as an American. And so it really does overlook cultural and linguistic diversity. My husband's first language is French. He has no detectable accent. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that as soon as he starts speaking French. Inevitably, there's a look of surprise just because what somebody is seeing doesn't align with their expectations. And that show of surprise is almost an indication of that disconnect that never got expressed. So the next one is, what do I have here? The next one is Alan, Gen Z, says to Jay, who's a boomer, as they work through this challenge with technology, they're troubleshooting some new software, and says, Alan says, oh, you probably won't understand the technology. It's too advanced for your generation. Talk about ageism. Ageism is a bias where we show a preference or we discriminate toward or disadvantage. It's not disadvantage. There's a word I'm missing, but we do that towards somebody in an age group, and it can be older and it can be younger. And in this case, you have somebody from a younger generation being very dismissive. It perpetuates that stereotype that the older you get, the less knowledgeable or fluent or adaptable you are with technology. And so it's very dismissive, and it doesn't understand or acknowledge that even if technology can be challenging for some, it might not have anything to do with age. With this next one, we have a colleague whose name is, let me see, I wrote down how to pronounce this because I didn't want to get it wrong. Katazina. I actually was trying to find a name that was particularly complicated, and I've complicated it for myself. But I wanted to put this here because what often happens is if you have an uncomfortable name, the person says, hey, can I just call you Katie? Because they don't want to try to say Katarzina's name. Katarzina, I said it wrong. I'm acknowledging that I said it wrong. And in fact, think about my name, Jana. I get this a lot. How do you say it? How do you say it? How do you say it? Wow, it's so hard to say. And people are, oh, I'm going to mess it up. My response is always, I don't care if you mess it up. All I ask is that you try. And the reason that this is important is that, as you see here on the slide, if I'm struggling with a name and just want to Americanize it, it's suggesting that the American name is preferred, that westernized identity is the one that I can relate to. This really comes down to the other person being more comfortable. And the thing about names in particular is that they have often a meaning. And that meaning can be of spiritual significance, cultural significance, family significance. It's a name that's passed down. So names can be just as impactful as a slight against a name, as one based on race or gender or age. And so this reason I put this example here is it's about awareness. It's not like we're going to not mess these things up. I will open mouth, insert foot again. The trick here is understanding and creating awareness where I might have done this before without realizing the impact I was having. And then this last example is a coworker who has MS is overheard asking for a reserved parking space. Can they move closer to the door? And their colleague was like, you don't look disabled. Do you really mean that? Talk about perceptions and stereotypes. 70% of disabilities are invisible. And so this just perpetuates the negative stereotypes that go with disability. There's a lot of stigma with that. And it's a reason why a lot of people don't reveal that by asking for an accommodation. They just come up with coping and adapting strategies so that they don't have to reveal it. So what are the different classifications in addition, what we have in addition to the general description? Sorry, we have Dr. Sue. Dr. Sue is a psychologist, and he specifically worked in multicultural counseling, racial and ethnic identity. He himself was the child of Chinese immigrants, and so he did a lot of work around microaggressions, breaking them down actually into further different types of microaggressions. We're going to walk through them here fairly quickly, just so that you're aware that they are. So a micro insult. This is when somebody says to a person of color that maybe they got the job because they were the diversity hire. They might not say it explicitly, but their comment is very suggestive of that. That's a micro insult where it's demeaning their very identity or heritage. You have micro invalidation. So an example here might be somebody that is saying that somebody who, Dr. Sue, the child of Chinese immigrants, he's born and raised in this country, but he'll be a perpetual foreigner. So that's an example where you're nullifying their own experiences. Then you have a micro assault. Now, keyword here is assault. This is very much conscious and intentional, but the micro part is it could be very passive aggressive. The verbal equivalent of a poke in the eye. It's an explicit and an intentional act. And if somebody is observing these or experiencing these in the workplace, please go to HR. This absolutely is an overt form of harassment, and it is critical for organizations to address these swiftly and firmly. Otherwise, it will send a very strong message very quickly that, yes, this is a toxic workplace. And then you have something called macroaggressions, and these are at the environmental level, and they really address an entire class of people. Some examples, actually in recent headlines, many that we're still navigating because they're political divisiveness, I'm going to say them, acknowledging that some of these might be politically divisive, but they're good examples. One might be a Confederate statue. One might be the naming of a sports team. I live in Maryland, the Washington Redskins, now the Commanders. Or what about, anybody remember the product Aunt Jemima? So these are the types of things that are terms that are used across an entire group of people. So I've given you a bunch of examples. Download the slides because a lot of these other things that are on these following slides are just further examples of these. So, where are you from? We've heard that one a lot. You don't speak English. I'm seeing somebody and I assume that they speak, I'm sorry, you don't speak Spanish. From their look, I assume that they speak another language. So this is part of what actually we move into this next section. This is part of what can start to create this really uncomfortable culture when we start to make these assumptions. And based on what we see, based on what we hear, based on our familiarity with a particular group, we don't know them very well. So there's this risk that we make assumptions about them. And not just that, but then we project them onto our colleagues through words, actions, deeds, behaviors, decisions. There's this really famous TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. I would encourage everybody to watch it. I remember when I first saw it, probably 8-9 years ago now. It's never left me. And one of the reasons is the speaker says, it's not that stereotypes are untrue, but that they're incomplete. And so that's what's really important to remember, is that what we know doesn't mean we know everything. And even what we know doesn't necessarily apply to the people that we work with. So when you hear them, when we see them, when we're involved in one, a lot of feelings come up, a lot of reactions come up. And it's easy to assume that these reactions are only from the person who is the recipient. It happened to you, it happened to me. But in fact, these experiences, these reactions can also be for the source, the person who said or did something. These could be the reactions of the bystander who was there when it happened. So it's important to realize that the impacts here are across all of those positions, whoever you were, whether you said it, you did it, or you observed it. There is a reaction that affects each of us individually. And acknowledging that, actually, here's a tip, a preview, acknowledging that is the first step. And how do we now handle it? Open mouth, insert foot, and you feel painfully conspicuous because you just did it, and they saw it, but you don't want to say anything, and neither do they because it's uncomfortable. We've all had those moments. When that moment becomes an insult that hits me at my core of who I am, it becomes even more precarious. And these feelings complicate things. Now, what are these impacts? There's a whole list of things here. And the challenge is that because it's reinforcing those stereotypes, it can also perpetuate bias, because there's a connection between bias and stereotypes. It's not necessarily direct and it's not causal, but there's definitely a connection there. And so it's really important to understand microaggressions in the broader social, cultural context, because the impact of interpreting these microaggressions can vary widely based on power dynamics, based on historical background, different cultural norms. It could be the specific identities that are involved. And so because they can be at all levels, very personal, we talked about those, or systemic, macroaggressions as an example, we need to look at those impacts in those same levels within organizations, one-to-one, within a team, a practice across an organization, a policy that we don't realize has an unintended impact or sends one of these messages to a particular group. So these organizational impacts at the personal level, and then you have organizational impacts systemically. One of the things that you think about here is the cumulative effect. Now, the cumulative effect of this, it's more likely to land on an individual because any one little slight can seem minor. You know, you could say we all get our feelings hurt, but then it gets to be more complicated when it seems to happen time and time and time again. Data and research tells us that this can erode and have an impact on someone's well-being at work. And the repetition and can turn into reinforcement of a stereotype across an organization. And it can then trigger down and have a domino effect on those very power dynamics that might be creating the problem. So we have a challenge, we don't address it. As a result, the challenge gets worse, leading to a different issue, and we start to cycle down. And so it's really important to understand that what might affect us at the individual level can eventually expand across an entire environment, creating that hostile or the toxic workplace that I was mentioning before. So a couple of things, when we hear people frustrated with microaggressions, challenging microaggressions, because there are some who will say that you're just being too sensitive, or you shouldn't take that so seriously. Well, these are some of the challenges and some of the pushback. This first one, you have to really be careful about what you say around here. I don't want to get labeled as aggressive or angry. That could be on both sides. So somebody's making a joke and then somebody says it's offensive, and then I can't respond because I don't want to be seen as angry. The flip of that is the stereotypical angry Black woman, something is said to her, but she can't respond for fear of being labeled as aggressive or angry. So this works both ways. You have patronizing. So here, a female colleague is expected to handle the tasks for everybody in the group. You can have a manager, a person of color is always the one that's, doing the preparation for a meeting, or it is the youngest person on the team that is always expected to set up the Zoom or reserve the conference room. And the challenge here isn't the one-time ask, because, all of us have to pitch in at different times to do different things, especially when it comes to the oh so fun administrative tasks. But it's when the person gets singled out over and over again that it becomes a problem. What are the different risks? Well, these are in response to what I was saying earlier, the fear of being stereotyped. A couple of things that are particularly new is something called cancel culture. And we're familiar with that today. Somebody says or does something that is perceived to be objectionable by many. And as a result, there's a mobilization to cancel that person. And that cancellation can take a number of different, can show up in a number of different ways. Worst case scenario, somebody loses their job. And this is because we don't know how to engage in a conversation around it and maybe learn from that experience. There's retribution, where somebody intentionally does something to harm somebody in the idea that they're going to balance out the justice. So there's a lot at play here. The psychological frailty, I do want to touch on that, because as we start to talk about coping strategies, this might be part of it. Psychological frailty is this idea that you're in this state of vulnerability, you're increasingly susceptible to experiencing emotional distress, having difficulty coping with anxiety, adversity. You're struggling to maintain this emotional balance at work. And Lord knows we've done a lot of presentations around mental health and wellness, and the importance of that at work. I'm grateful that we're having many of those conversations in the workplace today. But when you talk about psychological frailty, and then I have in parentheses here a victim mindset, they aren't directly related. The challenge, though, is that reduction in resilience because of the psychological frailty. I can be prone to stress. I can be prone to mental health issues. And that can then create a situation where I feel like things just keep happening to me. And then when you think that way, you start to perceive that you are the victim in all of this. And so there's a higher risk that we're going to start to see, or that an organization can see some of these on the part of the person who's feeling those slights. Right, I have another polling question coming up. I didn't forget in case somebody asks, because I know it comes up. The role of unconscious bias. I talked about this earlier, that bias does come into play. So what is bias? The definition is here: automatic, unintentional. Notice the parallels here: non-conscious, unintentional, right? Deeply ingrained biases or preferences that influence perceptions, judgments, and decision-making processes without our conscious awareness. We aren't aware that this is happening. And this lack of awareness, that sounds judgy. Let me say it differently. This non-conscious processing that is happening in the background, that is largely at play when we say and do things. So often, when I remember at the outset, I was saying that so often those miscommunications, those things that feel like snubs or slights, the things that can cause hurt, than not, people didn't set out to cause that harm. Set aside the micro assault that I talked about, or somebody who's driven by this sort of insecurity and just treats people poorly. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, there are exceptions, and people have really good intentions. But when we have unconscious bias, part of what's exacerbating the effect of the things that our brain does in the background to really streamline and help us create efficient, quick decisions is what compounds and sometimes causes these microaggressions. And so developing an understanding and awareness of unconscious bias and how it relates to the decisions that we make and the interpretations that we make every day, addressing unconscious bias can really help reduce the instance of microaggressions. And let's be clear, we're humans, so we're biased. We're never going to get rid of unconscious bias. This is about developing our self-awareness to better understand what might be driving some of our decision making. Let's go back to the example I gave about names. It's when I specifically talked about names, I wanted to put that example in there because sometimes we're not even aware that this can be hurtful. And in our minds, it's not a big deal. But as we start to understand a lot more fully and deeply some of the things that are associated with name, I was talking about cultural traditions or heritage. There could be very specific meanings in a particular a group, and it falls under the category of, wow, I didn't even know that could have been offensive like that. That's what I mean when I talk about becoming more aware and really thinking and doing some work around unconscious bias in organizations, because it ties directly to the instance of microaggression. Now, stereotypes. Stereotypes are this preconceived idea that about a group. It is usually oversimplified and it is projected across an entire group of people. We're familiar with stereotypes. Examples might be honey, endearing names, or I talked about earlier, millennials do the opposite of the one where Jay or Alan was demeaning Jay because he's too old. Well, what about somebody dismissing a millennial because they're too young or they're entitled? Or I talked about the angry Black woman. Those are the stereotypes that are at play. And when we see somebody, our first impression is often informed by that stereotype. We see a number of things. The first moment you meet somebody, we notice ethnicity, we notice race. I'll actually say skin color, because We notice tone differences, which we then attribute to race or to culture or to heritage. But we notice all of these things. But what we're really doing is we're making very quick impressions. And those impressions are the things that lead me to say and do things that I think are safe, that I think are funny, that I think is a an expression of curiosity when I ask that, when in fact it was an insult. And so just here are some examples of the difference between what we observe and the first impression that we make. Bias. I talked about bias, and there are lots of different biases at play. And so this is why it's important to understand the connection between, say, height bias, which means that somebody who's above or below this sort of uh, established normal height, and it varies by gender, it varies by culture, and so on. When they fall within or outside of these bounds, I start to have some preconceived notions about it, and it might lead me to say something that ultimately is offensive. All right, so the next polling question then, we're going to look at a couple of other definitions, and I'm curious how familiar you are with those definitions. And while you are doing the polling question, let me take a look at the Q&A. A couple questions have come in.
Yes, poll number 2 is up and running, and I have flagged those for you.
Thank you. So, would a comment like this be more acceptable? Oh man, I missed the timing of when that came in. Would a comment like this? So, Tara, if you could re-enter your question and say what the comment is, that would be really helpful so I can look at that. Isn't boomer a bad name for an older person? Actually, it is a generally used term to define people in a particular age, in an age band, and we have those names that are broadly used across society. That doesn't mean it can't be used as a pejorative. So it's just something to be mindful of. So what are we looking like? Familiarity. I see a lot of familiarity with both. The majority say they're familiar with neither. So we'll walk through these definitions pretty quickly because you do have the definitions on the slides. So stereotype threat. Essentially, this is somebody's experience of having people who have to deal with this risk that they are going to play into. They're going to validate a negative stereotype about a group that they are in. Claude Steele is the one who did a lot of work in this area. He was a social psychologist, professor emeritus of psychology at Stanford, and he did a lot of work here. And then the author of this book, Whistling Vivaldi, the story of Whistling Vivaldi is because, and I don't remember if it was him or somebody that was the result of some research, but a black man walking down the street, white woman cross the street when they see him coming, and Whistling Vivaldi, which is classical music, projected as, that he was a safe guy. And so people weren't crossing the street. Now that's the story I've heard. I've not read the book, but I'm familiar with the story, and that's where you get Whistling Vivaldi from. So that's stereotype threat. Identity threat is this fear or this concern that my group is underrepresented here, or it's undervalued, or the stereotype is that it's inferior. So all of that then will be projected onto me. And what it does is it increases this pressure to assimilate. There are a couple of different assimilation strategies that we have. First one is code switching. And the thing about code switching, adjusting your style of speech, your appearance, etc., we all do this to some degree. We tend to mirror those around us, and we might act differently in different social situations. That's not the problem. We all do it. Where it becomes an issue is where there's a tension between how I express myself and what I need to do for others to accept me in this group, specifically at this group at work, because the stakes are very high at work. Because if I don't fit in, I run the risk of being perceived as less competent, less committed, less engaged, not a good fit. And so there's an increased pressure when we have those other threats at play to code switch. Another one is holding back. And again, all of us have done this. Holding back, you specifically are hiding things about yourself. Somebody who does not disclose that they are lesbian or gay or gender well, I can't say gender nonconforming, maybe non-binary. They live in one lane or the other because they want to avoid discrimination. So that's actively holding back. I am not sharing information. The flip of that is covering, where I'm actively concealing information. I think the most visible example of that is a tattoo. Somebody literally puts makeup on it and putting on my neck, or always wears a long sleeve shirt if they have a full tattoo at the sleeve because they don't want to be judged. And then you have the one overcompensating, and that's where we perceive something, so we go far at the other extreme to counteract that. That doesn't necessarily work well, and it still means we're not behaving authentically. So all of these are strategies that people adopt in order to cope with or overcome stereotype threat, identity threat, what they feel has been an expression of bias toward them, often showing up in the form of microaggressions that they are experiencing in the workplace. Okay, so this gets us to our last section. How do we respond to them? Well, first of all, spotting them. That's the biggest challenge. It's just, they're just rude, or they're just being insensitive, or you know what, they're just oblivious, or they just don't care. They're indifferent to whatever the situation is. Because it's those things, it's not a microaggression. Now, I often say about microaggressions, it often falls into the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In many cases, it might seem like the person is being too sensitive and that it's not really a microaggression. And to that I say, if the impact on the person who is receiving end of this communication is that they feel marginalized, they feel discriminated against, and it spoke to or is tied to some specific aspect of their identity, their heritage, their culture, it's probably a microaggression. And here's the thing we know about lived experience. If somebody says this hurt them, believe them. It's not my job to say, well, they shouldn't have had that experience. And so that's what's important to understand about microaggressions, because it's not just necessarily about being rude. So rude, a waiter spills coffee on a customer and says, oh, I'm sorry. And then the customer says he was bad at his job. Well, that's rude. A microaggression would be a waiter specifically avoiding a table and being very slow to their service because of someone's race. At least that's what it seems like. So how do you respond to microaggressions? Well, first we have to recognize that what is at play. Could it be a lack of awareness? What about somebody is sort of the fight, flight, or freeze? They just, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, I'm uncomfortable, so they abandon the situation. They don't even try, and they don't process anything other than get out of there, and then that's the end of it, no further thought. And then there's some power dynamics that I mentioned earlier that might be at play here. And that retaliation I talked about earlier, maybe I don't want to respond because that I am afraid that there will be some payback, and that price is not a price I want to pay. And this might be because of the culture, that might be because of the past experience with this person, it might be because of their reputation in the organization. There are a lot of reasons that might cause people to respond differently or to not respond at all. So our next polling question, I'm curious, have you ever been involved in a microaggression? I'm going to walk through these strategies. And so I really wanted to ask this question because as we go through these strategies, I really invite you to scan through your memory and think about some of the interactions you've had in the past and maybe pull them into your present. Was it something you said or did? Would you do it differently today? Or was it something that was said or done to you? Might you react differently today? If you were the bystander, did you wish you got engaged? Would you engage today? And if your answer is not to my knowledge, I invite you to reflect on that. Chances are good you might have been involved in something that landed on someone in a way that was different than what was intended. Now, in hindsight, maybe it was a microaggression, but even if it wasn't, the strategies that we're going to walk through, we're going to go and look at how can we move past those open mouth, insert foot moments when somebody did or said something that had an unintended impact and that was perceived as hurtful, disrespectful, rude, or dismissive by the other person. So I see the answers here. 44%, if you want to post those answers. Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't give them a heads up to answer.
That's fine. We had plenty of time there. I will share the results. There you are.
So let's see, 44%, something was done to them. 22%, they took the action toward another. I thank you for answering that question honestly, because a lot of people would be resistant. 48% observed one. That's almost half of you. And then 30%, not to my knowledge. And so again, what I hope you can take from this session would be, what are some strategies that I can employ using this model in an uncomfortable situation? Let's make this uncomfortable conversations training. So what I like about this model, this triangle model, is that what it really wants to do is it wants to give us skills and a framework to respond. It acknowledges the humanity in all of us, and it helps us, hopefully sets us up to acknowledge and then learn from that interaction. And the idea here from a restorative justice perspective is that by using this method, it gives us an opportunity to restore our reputations and rebuild our relationships. So what does this model do? So the first one is, at the top, we have the recipient. This is the person that something was said or done to. And so what is the action that they can take? And so here you want to, first of all, assess how it makes you feel. Is it activating that fight, flight, or freeze? I should have put that up here. Fight, flight, or freeze reaction, being aware and noticing that in your body, noticing that in your emotions. If you're thinking about how to respond, you want to consider a lot of things, including physical safety. And here's the bottom line to all of this. The decision to move forward is yours and yours alone. How you respond to that. Will you take it on, or will you walk away from it? There is no judgment, and this is entirely what makes you comfortable, because if you choose to walk away, that's it, and we leave it alone. And this is something that if you are the bystander and you notice it, it's not your job to prescribe or dictate, well, you should do this or you should do that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But let's say you decide to take it on. Well, pick the time and the place. It doesn't have to be immediately, right away. You get to decide that. There's no rule on how long. You might need time to calm down. You might need time to recover emotionally, especially if it felt particularly hurtful. If you do respond immediately, you want to call out what happened, but you also don't want to put the other person on the defensive, because then the reaction could go very badly. If you decide to go later, it gives you some more time to think about it. But then the other side of it is the person might say, I don't even know what you're talking about, because the time was so far and it was so subtle and it was so non-conscious of them that they don't even remember doing it. So those are just a couple of things about picking the time about when you take it on. Now, if you decide to walk away, on the other hand, remember, your choice. One of the risks to think about here is that if you walk away, it might continue to happen. It is not your responsibility to eliminate this process in your organization, but recognize silence does have a cost. And it might mean you make the decision to leave because you don't see that it is safe here to do that. I'm not suggesting any of these things. What I'm trying to raise here are some risks and some considerations. The next one in the triangle is you're the one who did it. And so I have a couple thoughts here on that. You might be embarrassed. You might immediately, the reaction to that is often defensiveness. And so we want to be really thoughtful and acknowledge those feelings. And if we can recognize that there is in fact bias that's behind all of this, that can actually be helpful, because that will give us a position to move forward in a conversation. So I have a couple of things here for the person who said or did something. Apologize. And please don't ask for forgiveness. This is really about acknowledging the impact you had on somebody else and apologizing because that was not your intended impact. Maybe you asked for some feedback. You can try to say something like, wow, that was not at all my intention. I would really appreciate it if you can help me better understand, what happened here through this lens of humility. And then when they do give you feedback, expressing appreciation for that feedback. The triangle model walks through all of these. And in fact, I don't know if I put that on the slide. Okay, pardon me, folks. I'm going to go back to that slide to see if it's there. I did not. So I apologize, but if anybody is interested, email me. I'm happy to send you a direct link so you can read through the model because it really has some wonderful information there. And then the last one is you're the bystander. And being the bystander can be a really uncomfortable place for a number of reasons. One, what happened might really resonate with you for two reasons. One, wow, I've said something like that in the past, or I actually thought the same thing that they thought and didn't realize it was going to have the impact. So here you are sort of learning the lesson privately, which could stir up feelings for you. The other thing is you might have an identity that is shared with the person who was the recipient, but in your case, it's invisible. So you're offended, but you're in this bystander situation, and we're here to protect the recipient. So there's a lot that can happen here. And all of those feelings in you are completely normal, whether you're going to choose to get engaged. If you do, and this is actually true for everyone, it's an I statement. It's not a you, or we. It's how I feel. We don't want to be judgy. We want to be objective. And we always want to lean into this. In fact, all of these 3 points of the triangle lean into it with empathy. And empathy is really trying to understand the experience of the other person. It's not, I don't want you to feel bad for me. Feeling bad for somebody is sympathy. And generally speaking, none of us want your sympathy. What I want is your understanding. And so that's when we talk about approaching this with empathy, coming to better understand this. So this is true for all points of that triangle. The person who was the recipient of it may be extending some empathy to the situation that the person who was the source of it, maybe unintended lack of awareness. Before I go to the questions, because I see a couple in here, one of the things, I love this article, one of the strategies to address them, especially if they're systemic, if you will, or they tend to happen more often than we think, or how. I didn't mean to say that. Or frankly, even the little moments that it does happen, micro interventions are great because these are these little validations that reinforce the values of the person, the reality of the people who are the recipients of these. It's a moment where you can offer support and encouragement, and it doesn't have to happen at the moment as a bystander. And so being able to offer some of these micro interventions can really help move the needle in the conversation, create awareness, and offer a safer space for those who are the recipient of these and might feel more empowered to engage. All right, so we have a little bit of time for some questions. So let me see. Somebody did say boomer feels negative to them, and I can appreciate that. I know I'm a Gen Xer, and sometimes I kind of roll my eyes at that. But again, that term is used for a number of different reasons. It can still be used negatively. So that's the tone to be listening for. All right, so I say here, would a comment like this be more acceptable if you already had the knowledge of their background? Like they knew the coworker was not born in the other country. It might be, and remember the beauty is in the eyes of the beholder point. If you know the person was not born in another country, and you ask a question in a way that was offensive, then the opportunity is for learning. In that triangle model, this is well, tell me a little bit more about the offense. I didn't really understand how that could impact you or have that effect on you. And I could be saying, I don't understand how you could have seen it that way. It's an opportunity for conversation. Somebody just said boomer. I answered that one. In a day where many people move around within America and aren't necessarily from the city they're in, is there a way to ask where you're from as a way of getting to know somebody without implying that you think they're from another part of the country? Yeah, you start talking about where you're from. And so you can talk about your background and your experiences. And if if the conversation flows, then hopefully naturally they'll do the same. Um, the situation and the context does matter, the relationship does matter. So these are things to factor in. There's no hard and fast rule on when it is and when it's not a microaggression, but we do know that there are examples of microaggressions. Where are you from? Question. Can, especially when the question is suggesting based on the surrounding context and potential follow-up. No, but where are you really from? That is where this gets to be exacerbated. If you are truly interested, oh, this is the same one. How are we supposed to ask where someone is from? There are a number of different ways to do that. My mom's from the Philippines, and so I have the natural ability to automatically detect a Filipino accent. So of all the accents across the Pan-Asian accent world, the world of different Pan-Asian countries, I can 99 times out of 100 tell you that somebody's from the Philippines. And because of that, I will ask, do you mind if I ask where you're from? And if they tell me, I can then say, wow, that's what I thought. My mom's from the Philippines. And immediately it's a positive moment. If they hesitate, I could say, my mom's from the Philippines and I was wondering because sometimes, and again, it can make it a positive moment. So it just depends. Oh, it depends. Don't you like that? That's the answer most of the time. Somebody said as a relation, oh, thank you for giving me that follow-up. It was in relation to commenting on someone's English ability. Huh. So English ability is an important one because in our country, oh, by the way, let me go ahead and let's do that last poll as we wrap things up. English ability is an interesting one because in our country, there's a particular bias toward people who we assume speak a foreign language or are born in another country or are immigrants. It's a known challenge that we have. It's been demonstrated through research and findings that as Americans, we tend to see foreigners as less intelligent. And so that it carries into people who do or don't speak English and the assumptions we make about whether people should even be able to speak English as articulate as they can be. You're so articulate is definitely don't say that to somebody because there's a higher risk of, for example, that one being offensive. So I hope that this has been helpful to you all. We are coming up on time. Thank you so much for joining me. And as we close out this poll, well, I'm not suggesting we close it now, but you'll see here my contact information. It's in the slides. It's here at the end of the deck on the screen. If you have any questions, because I know there was one in particular that came in and with that resource, the triangle method, I really encourage you to look that up. It is a great framework for addressing these microaggressions in a way that can help us all retain our dignity. And as it said, repair those relationships, which are just so important. We don't want to break down culture. What we want to do by understanding this is to foster that space where people do feel safe, where we invite and respect, value, and appreciate all of those differences and have strategies for all of those little bumps in the road that are going to happen when our lack of awareness about some of those differences cause us to say something that was not at all intended to be offensive, but accidentally was. So I hope this has been helpful. And again, thank you so much for joining me.